We're going to spend some time tonight to just ready our hearts for observation of the Lord's Supper. I always say that Good Friday is one of those services that you don't have to try very hard. And I think all of us come tonight with some degree of weariness, of meditation, of heavy hearts for what this day means for us. And we're going to spend some time here in a little bit to just focus intently on Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. But what I wanted to do before we did that is just to set the context a little bit for what it means to take the Lord's Supper together. And to do that, I'd like to read from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 26, just reading from 26 to 29. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." I know this is a familiar passage for many of us. If you've been at church for some time, you've certainly observed the Lord's Supper before. Many times the Gospel of Matthew is read when we take the elements together. But there's a saying I like to use sometimes, and that's just read it again for the first time. And try to place yourself now in the upper room with Jesus and his disciples. They are reclining next to a table, not like we would recline at a table, but they are leaning in on their left side, and which would be consistent fashion for that time to enjoy a meal together. And Jesus is taking them through what I think is a very traditional observation, at least in parts, of what's called the Seder meal. And this is on Thursday night. It's commonly called Monday, Thursday, if you come from a tradition that uses that word. It's from a Latin word where we get the word mandate, and it's really in reference to the mandate that Jesus gave in the upper room that we would love one another as he has loved us. And so some of the things that Jesus does in this meal, he changes a few things. But before we think about that, again, just kind of think about the presence and think about the day. And think about some of the things that would have taken place. Earlier that afternoon, Jesus would have sent some of his disciples onward to procure the needs for the meal, to perhaps procure the room, and that was, all provided for them. They would have gone to the temple. They would have selected the lamb to be sacrificed, and they would have had all the accoutrements that they needed for the meal to observe it. And there were different things that they would have used in this meal. There was, of course, the Passover lamb. There were bitter herbs. There was wine, of course, and unleavened bread. And the Seder meal was a very structured meal. It was not just a gathering. There was an officiant of it, meaning that there was somebody, a rabbi or perhaps the father in the home, would be leading in the progression. And so the first part would have been just a very typical blessing that would have been spoken over the meal. And the whole purpose of the Passover meal was to look backwards, to retell the story of God's gracious redemption of the nation of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And so Jesus would have said a blessing over the meal, and then it was very typical for them to wash their hands. Now I say that because this is one of the areas that you see where Jesus changes it. Instead of washing hands, he takes a basin himself, girds himself with a towel, and begins to wash the disciples' feet. And I think it would have been in that time of the meal that it would have been very typical for them to wash their hands, but Jesus demonstrates a lowly spirit, a lowly heart, and is a servant among them. They would have dipped the herbs in salt water to remind them of the bitterness of slavery, the bitterness of their tears. They would have taken the unleavened bread. They would have been uncovered. It would have been there for them to look at. And Jesus then would have taken a second cup, and he would have retold the story here of the Exodus account. And after he would retell the story of the Exodus account, they would take the cup, and then the meal itself would be observed. And at about this time, Jesus would take the bread and he would actually break it. And a traditional saying here would remind them of the blessing that God would give them and the blessing that God has given them. In fact, this is the poor bread that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. All who are hungry, let them come and eat. All who are needy, let thee come and partake of the Passover sacrifice. But what Jesus does in the Passover meal is, as he breaks that bread, he does something that would have been very startling for these Jewish men. He says, "This is my body, broken for you." Identifying himself with the Passover story, but also identifying himself more fully as the Passover lamb. He would have taken that bread, he would have passed it around, and after they would have eaten, there would have been a third cup, and this would have been the cup of redemption. And it was a conflation typically of different passages of Scripture, mostly from Exodus chapter 6. But of course, once again, Jesus takes the cup and he changes the wording. And he says, "This is the cup of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Again, connecting himself with the means of redemption. So as we think about some of the aspects of this, there would have been a fourth cup as well as they would have departed later. But it is in between this third cup and the fourth cup that I want us just to take a moment to stop and to think about this idea of covenant. In the Old Testament, there were several of these major key covenants that were given to the nation of Israel that shaped all of reality for them and how they understand their relationship with their covenant God. The first one is often called the Abrahamic Covenant. It was the promise given to Abraham that through Abraham there would always be a nation, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. And that was a binding, standing covenant. And there was another covenant that was given to King David that we call the Davidic covenant, that David would always have a representative on the throne. When we get to about 500 years after the Davidic covenant, though, we read of a new covenant promised by Jeremiah and Ezekiel both. And different aspects of the new covenant, depending on which one you read of the prophets, they emphasize different things, but they essentially emphasize the newness. The newness and writing the law upon the nation's hearts because they were incapable to live it out. And so they would have new hearts and they would have new minds and a new relationship, new knowledge. But in relationship to what Jesus says, he promises that there would be new forgiveness. And what's amazing about the new covenant and what's amazing about the Lord's Supper itself is now we have what's called the inauguration of the new covenant. And Jesus says, when you've read this 500 years prior through the prophets, they weren't looking at a time that is beyond you. In fact, Jesus says they were talking about a time which is now. And that it is by means of his blood that is spilt that you will have the provisions of this new covenant. Jesus, of course, says that is really by verse 28, the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. We're reminded here that apart from the shedding of blood, there is never, ever any remission for sins. In order for us to be forgiven, restored, redeemed, in order for us to be made whole, in order for us to be made new, we needed a Passover lamb. We needed one to bleed for us, to die for us. Listen to what Peter says in 1 Peter. He says, "Knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot." What we really see in Good Friday, I love this quote by John Stott. I've used it before with you. He says, "The problem of forgiveness is constituted by the inevitable collision between divine perfection and human rebellion, between God as he is and us as we are. And Christ is the link. He is the means in which the human rebellion in our hearts is resolved, forgiven, restored, that we might be reconciled to God." We're going to continue our worship by continuing going through the Gospel of Matthew together. So if you have a Bible, just invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 26. And we're going to be looking specifically like I said, at the Garden of Gethsemane, and that really begins in verses 36 to 46. And as you're finding there, I should say many of you know I grew up in the great state of Texas, and because when you grow up in the great state of Texas, one of the things you do is you learn about the great state of Texas's history. And the Alamo, of course, is kind of the epitome of Texas history. And when we lived in the San Antonio area, we always had friends that wanted to come and go to the Riverwalk and do things. And, you know, the Alamo is right there in downtown San Antonio. And honestly, it's not that impressive of a structure, but it is historical. And one of the things that always struck me as we would walk by there, you would always see so many different people from around the world. It's just a world-renowned structure, symbol for Texas independence. But there was a famous letter that was written by Colonel William Barrett Travis, and it was dated on February 24th, 1836. And this is what he wrote. He said, "To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion, otherwise the garrison are to be put to the sword. If the fort is taken, I have answered the demand with cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character to come to our aid. With all dispatch, the enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country." Famously, he signed it, "Victory or Death." It's a remarkable letter. There are copies, I believe, of it in the gift shop that you can buy at the Alamo. It's well known. I think I had one when I was a kid. But I want to just focus intently on that last clause, that last expression, victory or death. For William Barrett Travis and those that were in the Alamo, it was a certain death. Of course, many of them, all of them really died, except for maybe a handful that we know of just about 13 days later. But as we think about Good Friday, one of the ironies, tragic ironies for us, but also the glorious ironies, is that through the death of Christ, Christ is ultimately victorious. It wasn't victory or death. For Christ, it was victory through death. It was victory through what he had to do. And what I want to do is just for a few brief moments, just as a devotional, focus our thoughts, focus our reflections on the beauty and the majesty and the greatness of our Lord, specifically in this prayer that he prays in the garden. I want to marvel at his submission, and I want to ache together with his agony. Charles Spurgeon said this about when he would preach about Jesus and his beauty. He says, "I am never more vexed with myself than when I have done my very best to extol his dear name. What is but holding a candle to the sun? I can't speak as I would of him. The blaze of this sun blinds me." I think as we go to this passage, we want to think about that the blazing light of the Son of God is like just placing a candle next to him that words just can't possibly express. I want to get the context, and this follows right after Jesus gives them the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper. And read with me in Matthew chapter 26, verses 30 to 35. This is the prediction of Peter and the rest of the disciples, their failure and Peter's denial. "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' And Peter answered him, 'Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away.' Jesus said to him, 'Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, 'Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. We find here that they are en route to what's called the Mount of Olives. This is going to be on the eastern side of the city. And they would have sung a hymn, very likely from somewhere from Psalm 113 to 118, probably Psalm 118, as they were going this direction after the Passover meal. And it wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. In fact, Jesus and his disciples would have frequented this garden called Gethsemane, which literally means olive press. And it was very likely a place where Jesus and his disciples had some sort of acquaintance with the owner, that they would have allowed for him to be there. But it was also very late, as we'll see, probably around midnight by this point. And so look with me in verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. Again, it's late, likely midnight, but it's not just a chronological detail that's important for us to consider. It's also where Jesus is seeing his mission really come into laser crisp focus. And he's beginning to know and he's beginning to see his eventual arrest and betrayal become a reality. Everything up until this point in his ministry had been building to this moment. And so he goes and he prays. He prays. One of the things I love about this passage, as we'll reflect on it, is you see the dignity of Jesus' deity as well as his full humanity on display for us to marvel at. We find God himself in the flesh, in sorrow, in suffering, awaiting his total humiliation and the total execution on the cross. Continuing on in verse 36, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." It's likely that they come maybe to a very low gate. Jesus leaves the majority of his disciples with him, and they are en route now to a place further into the garden. And he says, "I want you to stay here, keep watch, keep alert for what is about to transpire as I go and as I pray." And you can't help but wonder, what are they thinking at this moment? You know, Jesus had said something just prior about them all denying him, leaving, Peter failing. What is going on in their minds? Do they really understand the gravitas of the moment? Do they really comprehend that Jesus' final sermon and final public miracle had really been accomplished up to this point? And then we read about Jesus' sorrow in verse 37. He says here, taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." Now, Jesus made a habit often to take the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, with him, and he gave them a front row seat in most of everywhere that he went. You might think of the Mount of Transfiguration, and it wasn't just for historical details, though, that Jesus was interested. It wasn't just so that Peter and James and John would see, perhaps, up close and be able to give an account of these things later. It was really more than that, because Jesus is teaching them, as he's teaching us, that in his trial, in his trauma, in his distress, he goes to his knees and he goes to pray, modeling for them what they must do later on in their own ministries, that they wouldn't be so quick to assume their own self-importance and reliability in their own strength. But also, Peter and James and John would have access, and not just as historians, but as theologians, bring us to this moment as when we reflect on the despair of Jesus. We would just translate this very woodenly. Jesus would have said something like this: "Deeply sad is my soul unto death." It was rather emphatic in the word order in the Greek. And he says, literally, "My heart is ready to break with grief. Stay here and keep watch with me." Matthew is the only one that includes a little detail of "with me." And we're told that Jesus would walk just a little bit beyond. Luke says he watches or goes just a stone's throw, and he begins to pray. And read with me in verse 39. And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Jesus goes and he falls on his face before God the Father, and he begins to pray, begins to intercede. Luke tells us that he's laboring in prayer so powerfully that there is sweat like drops of blood coming off of his forehead, that he is working and laboring, and still in this moment he says, "Father." It's the tone of intimacy, the tone of love, the tone of dependence. That God, his Father, is not distant, but God, his Father, is there with him. But it is his request that we really find to be striking. He says, "If it is possible, let this cup be taken from me." Now, there's always speculation on what exactly he means, but it's very likely, in fact, almost definite, that he's referring to a cup of wrath. The image of the cup is often associated with God's wrath in the Old Testament. And here it's Jesus' own anticipation that he is not only going to take that cup, but he's going to drink every last drop of that cup, assuming the position of being our substitute. And so one commentator said, well, maybe it is a sense that he says, "May I not have this cup remain with me. I know that I have to drink it, but may it not remain with me perpetually forever." Maybe there's something to that, but it is in Jesus' prayer that we find the juxtaposition of his humanity and his mission as the Son of God. Of course, he returns in verse 40. He came to the disciples, found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, singling him out, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus singles out Peter. Peter is often the outspoken one of the group. And Peter has often been outspoken throughout the last 3 years. And so he singles him out, but he's really speaking to not just Peter, but to James and John there. And perhaps the other disciples would have been roused as they heard him say this. But Jesus in his humanity wants their company. I find that to be amazing. Even in this moment of grief and trouble, as Jesus is praying to God his Father. In fact, Luke tells us that an angel there even brought him comfort. Jesus wants to find comfort in his friends. And he offers this statement that all of us can relate to on some level. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. He says, "Watch out lest you will fall into temptation." Well, what might that be? Well, the temptation has already been predicted that he will fail in, that he is going to scatter, he's going to deny Christ. And so as we keep going in the story, Jesus returns again to pray in verse 42. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Very similar to his first prayer, but he mentions the idea of him lest he has to drink it. Of course, you know the story. He comes back here to his disciples in verse 43. Again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. Now, Matthew doesn't say that he says anything. Mark tells us in his account, in the parallel account, that they didn't know how to answer him. And so it's likely that maybe Jesus comes after praying for some extended time, very similar prayer. He returns back to his friends. He finds them sleeping. And maybe him coming and rustling through the woods and the olive trees would have aroused them, would have awoken them up. But they didn't know what to say to him. Their eyes were heavy. I don't know if you've ever tried to watch a midnight showing premiere of any movie. I can't do that. My eyes get so heavy. And the disciples are human just like all of us, and their eyes are heavy as well. Verse 44, so leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. And then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. And one of the things I find very ironic, and I think it's intentional, is that Jesus had already told Peter that Peter would deny him 3 times. What did Jesus do? He came back once, twice, 3 times, foreshadowing the weakness of these disciples, foreshadowing their eventual denial, their eventual leaving and departing in fear and apprehension. And even here, when there's no soldiers and there's no authorities, these poor disciples could not stay awake with their rabbi and pray with him. Jesus says something very poignant. He says, see, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed, or literally given over into the hands of sinners. There's always a question here about how did Jesus get arrested? Was it because of Judas, the traitor? Well, certainly that's the case. Was it because of the jealousy of the religious authorities, their anger, their hostility? Was it because of the Romans? Was it because of Pilate? Was it because of the Roman soldiers? What was it that was the root cause for why Jesus was handed over? Well, Jesus uses the word Paradiddima, and it would be a word that was often and would be often quoted by the New Testament authors. And it's a callback to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 10, 11, and 12. Where there it says, quite literally in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it was the Father's good will to hand him over. And so who handed Jesus over? It was the Father's good pleasure to hand his Son over. And it is Jesus who is submitting himself to the will of his Father. It is not God the Father's sadistic pleasure or goodwill like we might think of this, but this is the foreordained plan A. There is no plan B for man's salvation. That it is Jesus in this moment is given over into the hands of wicked men to die a sinner's death as our perfect substitute. And then we see the strength of Jesus. After he prays, rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. We can't help but to contrast our own strength, and we'll wrap up here. That oftentimes when we are given over to our own self-reliance in our spiritual journeys, we find ourselves to be confident in ourselves. That self-confidence brings us to a place that we would be sleepy in our spiritual condition, that we would seek sleep, and it is in that sleepiness that we would be given over to temptation, and in that temptation we would sin, and then there is disaster in our Christian lives. But here we see Jesus, the complete opposite. He was dependent upon God, his Father. He did not sleep. He did not give in to temptation. He certainly did not sin. And his death on the cross was anything but a disaster. It was victorious. We're going to stop here, and we're going to put 4 thoughts on the screen for you, and this is how we're going to conclude our service tonight. I'm done speaking. Now it's time for you to speak with God. And now it's time for you to reflect on these 4 thoughts that we have up there. We're going to play some music for you. We're going to simply be still before God. The lights are low, and this is time for you to do some business with the Lord, to be reminded as we are remembering what it is that God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Whenever you're ready to leave, I don't know when that might be, we would just simply ask you to walk silently, quietly out of these doors. Don't disturb the person to your right or to your left, that they might have some serious business that they need to do with God tonight as they reflect on what it is that Christ did for us. After that, you'll be dismissed.